Greetings to everyone. This afternoon we're meeting to discuss, to hear a discussion from Professor Naidu. I think the rest, she's going to introduce herself because I might miss some of the important things about her. For all I know that she is a professor and she is also a dental and public health specialist at the University of Western Cape. She is also a director of the UWC WHO Collaborating Center for Oral Health. She is really mainly involved in postgraduate education and training. Her focus is research, as you can see, especially infectious diseases and infection control. She has presented in many papers. I think this is what I can say about her. The rest she is going to elaborate to us, and she is going to be sharing with us a topic on ethical issues in research. Professor Naidu, the audience that is with you today is drawn from across the African globe and beyond, and they are all health professionals in different disciplines. Over to you to present today's topic. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Cynthia, for that introduction. I don't need to say any more regarding my CV. You pretty much got the gist of it. We have quite a intensive session today. It was a tall order by St. Curate for the kinds of things we are expected to talk about in this afternoon's program. So let me start then. And if you don't mind, I will remove my video once I get the screen onto full screen so you can actually get to see it properly. But thank you then for having me, and I hope you are going to understand and appreciate the session and the ethical issues we're going to talk about. And just to say, if we do get cut off at some later stage this afternoon, it will be on account of the fact that we are load shedding and I will not have any internet connection. So I'm apologizing for that in advance. So let's today then, the aim of the series of lectures that I will present will hopefully familiarize you with some of the basic principles of research ethics. And finally, hopefully, once you get that information, that you will be able to prepare information sheets and consent forms for your research protocol, which is what usually then, when you submit your protocols to research ethics committees, I'm sorry, let me just put that down. Put that down, thank you, sorry. So hopefully when you submit your protocols now, you will be confident that the ethical aspects have been addressed. So let me just move on then to the objectives. I'm sorry, you've got to please excuse me for
So while she's organizing something, please let's write down our concerns, our questions and questions on the chat so that we can discuss them later. And my apologies, we did not allow for self-introductions because we are going to be having a load shedding on your site at about 15:30. So would rather have the presentation and then get the gist of today's business. And my apologies for that. Individual presentation, introductions, we have omitted them because of the time factor.
So sorry, my apologies. Okay, so I want to maybe, how do I get rid of that? I want to share, sorry. I'm trying to get a full screen here, saying I can't get rid of this now. Murphy's Law, slideshow. That's it. Can everybody see the screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm losing. I cannot seem to get rid of the thumbnails from the side. That's blocking the presentation. So I hope that isn't in your vision. Is that okay?
The screen is okay on our side.
Okay.
Is that
all right? So I'm going to start these lectures by talking about the historical background to why we have research ethics when we do our studies, and why research ethics committees are so fussy nowadays, wanting to know exactly what are the ethical issues you are going to consider when you are carrying out your research. So I'm hoping you're going to understand why it's all come about, and I will talk about some historical cases that have resulted in the guidelines and codes that have developed over the years for research. I'm hoping as well that you're going to understand why it is we need good science and good ethics in research. And hopefully you will understand the importance of why we need participant protection when we carry out research. So what is research ethics? Research ethics essentially refers to the moral issues involved in the research process. It involves as well the scientific integrity of the investigator carrying out the research, and obligations that are implicit in the relationship you are going to have as the researcher with the participants. So ethical problems, though, are a commonplace thing in the execution of a research project, especially those that involve human participants. I'm going to come back to this at a later stage, but these are some of the broad values we expect a researcher to have, and we will talk about this a bit later. And people say, where, when, and how much ethics do we need when we carry out research? And essentially the answer is everywhere, always, and we need as much as possible ethical background to carry out good research. So research ethics essentially involves the systematic analysis of ethical and legal questions to ensure that the study participants in your research are protected and ultimately that the research we conduct is in such a way that it serves the needs of our research participants, but also the society as a whole. And there are numerous ethical guidelines and codes, and they are often interpreted in a multiple way. And minimizing exploitation is key to why we need research ethics. And we're going to talk about some ethical principles now. And a single ethical principle is really absolute. And it's never a case where when we're carrying out research that one principle is enough. So in developing countries, research often poses many difficult ethical dilemmas. And this could be because we get researchers coming to do research in developing countries on account of the fact that the costs are lower, the risks of litigation are much lower. There's often less stringent ethical reviews in place. Hopefully that is changing now. And we often have populations that cooperate with the research investigators. Again, we need to be very careful when we're working in developing countries regarding cultural sensitivity, first-person consent, obtaining valid informed consent. And then we need to think about things like appropriate counseling, depending on the kind of research you are doing, and what kind of care and preventive measures are we going to be offering to participants during the course of our research. So I'm going to go a little bit back now with the historical perspective. And we know that ethical questions in research have been debated since World War II. And following that, there was a significant expansion in the research activities of the scientific community. The end of World War II, research was viewed, as a matter of national security to protect the armed forces and the nation from infectious diseases and other illnesses. So there was this flurry of research activities with many scientists, many investigators, and a lot of them were given or had considerable autonomy in the manner in which they conducted research during that time. And unfortunately, many scientists at that time aggressively pursued their own personal scientific goals and agendas. And in many instances, the respect and compassion for the participants who were part of their research received much less attention than was due. So as we move back in time now, I'm going to describe some of the research atrocities that eventually made it essential for ethical rules and guidelines to be developed to protect research participants. And that story begins in 1932. As you can see, these are some of the variety of cases where there were violations of participant rights in research, and we'll go through some of them now. And essentially in 1932, we had the Tuskegee syphilis study that was started in America. And what happened here was that about 400 African American males were denied treatment for syphilis, and essentially they were taken into a research project where they were left untreated during this time, only because the researchers wanted to get an idea of what happens with the pathogenesis of syphilis and how does it evolve over a period of time without treatment. So these men were all attending this hospital thinking they were getting care for their problems, but in actual fact, they were being monitored as the disease progressed unabated. So when the story was exposed in 1972, 74 of those 400 men were still untreated and living. And in 1974, the National Research Act was passed, and the Belmont Report was published in 1979. And this was one of the first tenets for ethical research. And it was based on three major principles: the respect for autonomy, beneficence, and justice. Another scandal that happened in 1962, this was from the early 1950s. I'm sure some of you heard about the drug called thalidomide. And at that time, in the early 50s, thalidomide was an approved sedative in Europe. And at that time, it was being used widely in pregnant women to treat morning sickness, to prevent premature delivery, etc. It was not, however, approved by the FDA in the United States, but despite the fact that it was not approved, over 20,000 American women were given the drug on an experimental basis without their informed consent. And the drug had very severe teratogenic side effects on the fetus of the developing child. And many were born then without arms and legs and feet, etc. Then another study was the chronic hospital case, chronic disease hospital study, where clinicians at this hospital were injecting live cancer cells into people who did not have cancer without their consent while they were doing experiments. And that case came before the Supreme Court in the 60s, and the Supreme Court found the researchers guilty of fraud, deceit, and unprofessional conduct. And then in the late 50s, we had an incidence of the Willowbrook study, where at a school for mentally defective children, they were injected with hepatitis A so that, again, the scientists could watch them and track the development of the viral infection in these children. And that study began in 1956 and ended in 1970. So again, with that particular study, there were numerous criticisms. For example, that people felt it was morally wrong to perform experiments on mentally retarded children when no benefits resulted for the children. They said that institutionalized people should not be used for human experimentation. Every patient has the right to be treated decently, and every physician has an obligation, first and foremost, to their patients. And the patient's right should supersede every consideration. And therefore, for them to do this kind of study without the participant or the patient's consent was totally immoral and unacceptable. So from some of those cases that I've just described, there were many, many more. We then had numerous codes and guidelines that were since developed, some of which we still use and refer to today. So in 1947, the Nuremberg Code came out after the atrocities from World War II, the experimentation that was done then, resulted in the Nuremberg Code that really then spoke about the importance of research being based on good science, and very importantly, that there is informed voluntary consent obtained from participants who want to be part of a research study. Then the Helsinki Declaration was first adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964. Since then, it's had about 7 amendments to it. The most recent one was in October 2013. In 1979, I mentioned to you after the Willebroek study that the Belmont Report was formed. And just for some of us in Africa who have medical research councils, we do have Medical Research Council ethical guidelines on carrying out research. Some years ago, there was a group of researchers and ethicists that met in Singapore, and at the end of their meeting, they came up with the Singapore Statement on Research Integrity that had 4 principles: honesty, accountability, professionalism, and stewardship. And then they also described 14 responsibilities related to those principles for conducting ethical research. So integrity is a fundamental way of leading one's life that does not vary from situation to situation. And good ethical practice means we take responsibility for ourselves and our participants by ensuring that we are going to act in the best possible way while we are carrying out research. And integrity, what is it, you ask? It's essentially the adherence to the value of respect for an individual's autonomy, a commitment to act in the participants' best interest. We avoid causing any harm to them. We always tell the truth and be honest. And then we ensure that whatever research we do is equitable and fair. So there are 4 key principles that are in many, or if not all, the codes of ethics that you will see. And it's basically non-maleficence, which means do no harm, beneficence, do good, autonomy, and justice. And we will talk about each of these now a little bit further. So non-maleficence, do no harm, is essentially the founding principle of all health professionals. When they swear on the Hippocratic Oath, they then, our first obligation is to do no harm. And remember, when we carry out research, a participant gives us access to their information, to their bodies, and this is based on trust. And this is because fundamental to this trust is that the participant knows that the researcher will do them no harm. And we got to stay on our side of this bargain as researchers. And our obligation then to ensure that we do no harm is to keep our knowledge and skills current and to know our own limitations. Over time, this definition of non-maleficence, do no harm, has evolved and also now includes instances of not inflicting harm, for us to prevent harm, for us to remove harm if we see it, and to always do or promote good. So the definition has broadened to incorporate issues of prevention and promotion. So moving on to beneficence now, this too found in all our healthcare codes And a researcher's actions, behaviors, and attitudes must be consistent with the commitment to benefit others. We must also ensure that we remove any harm that we see. We need to focus on doing good for the participant. And we need to take all appropriate actions to ensure that we can restore a participant to good health. So autonomy now a very important principle, and this basically means it's you let the person make a decision about their own health and their own bodies. It's an autonomous person is somebody who can choose their thoughts and actions that are relevant to his or her needs, and that we permit them to do that. So researchers must respect autonomy by allowing them to make and take their decisions. But for them to make those decisions, they need to be properly informed about all aspects of the research, what is going to be done, what is going to be provided or offered. And we need to fully and adequately explain parameters of research and benefits and risks that they may have if they participate in the research study. So the respect for autonomy, again, has been around for many, many years. We, in various forms, we can say we need to tell the truth, respect the privacy of others, protecting confidentiality. All these are related to autonomy. When asked, help others to make important decisions. And finally, we talk about justice. And this is the manner in which we then provide individuals or even groups of individuals with what is owed, due, or deserved to them. It's also in some instances described as the principle of equality, where we treat participants with similar needs in the same manner, regardless of age, gender, social status, religion, and other things. And this is especially important, the issue of justice, when we want to talk about doing any kind of research related to or within a public sector environment, where there we need to think about issues of the availability of resources and how we are going to distribute them. And we have many ethical dilemmas when we talk about the different choices that may have to be made, the benefits and the burdens that need to be balanced to ensure we are being fair and equal when we carry out our research, particularly so in the private sector. So related to those four principles that I've just described, non-maleficence, beneficence, autonomy, and justice, there are two values and concepts that I want to talk about now that support those four principles of ethics. And these are informed consent and confidentiality. So informed consent is essentially a participant's voluntary authorization to participate in a research study based on his or her understanding of the relevant information provided. And essentially, this is based on the principle of respect for autonomy, where we acknowledge that the participant must be given the opportunity to comprehend the knowledge we give them, weigh the alternatives, and to form their own judgments. So it's really a two-pronged process where we provide the participants with appropriate information, they assimilate it, and then make an informed decision. Confidentiality, this is a critical aspect of trust, and it's mentioned in all codes of ethics. And we know that trust is absolutely essential for the exchange of personal or intimate information. from the participant, and it is related to us being respectful of the participant, that we hold what they give us of their personal and intimate details, we hold it confidential. And it involves the participant exercising again his or her autonomy in what information they want to provide to the researcher. And if they trust us, they will be happy to share information, knowing that we are going to keep it confidential. So Hippocrates, many hundreds of years ago, said, in my attendance of the sick, or even when apart from it, whatever I see or hear concerning the life of men, which I ought not to talk about, I will keep silence thereon, counting such things to be sacred secrets. And the Declaration of Geneva at the World Medical Association in 1983, they said, I will respect the secrets confided in me even after the patient has died. So confidentiality, a very important part of the values related to ethics. And often we know participants are unwilling to disclose status, especially of infectious diseases if they have it. And we have to understand that patients have a right to privacy. And we know in some instances we may need to pass confidential information onto our colleagues or other researchers, but we can only do that with the participants' permission. If we deliberately break this confidentiality and breach this right of confidentiality, in many instances, it will constitute an unlawful act. And we know that confidentiality is not absolute. So these are some of the challenges we have with ethics, where we know sometimes we need to transmit information. And we know as well that the ethical duty of a researcher extends not only to the participants, but it may also extend to others whose life and safety may be affected by non-disclosure. But again, I want to reiterate, participants have to be consulted before you make any disclosure of their confidential information to a third party. So just to throw it out there, usually if we are open and face-to-face, some of the kinds of things now from the discussion we've just had, you know, think about these case studies. What are some of those ethical issues we just described that will be of concern to you in these two case studies? So in the first one, we've got a research group from the United States and a research group of our African researchers. They want to collaborate on an HIV vaccine trial in a rural community in your town. Otherwise, there's a trial of nevirapine, which is being planned among women in a small disadvantaged rural community of yours to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV. What are some of the ethical issues that we may be concerned with when we are approached to participate in studies of this nature? So these may be some of the questions we need to stand back and ask ourselves. Why are rural people being chosen to carry out this study? Why are we choosing poor, disadvantaged people? Why is the study being carried out in Africa? Why not in the United States? How are they going to appreciate the cultural language barriers that might come up in this kind of research? who's going to benefit from the study and in what way, what information is being provided to participants to participate, what consent is going to be obtained, who is going to give the consent, etc., etc. So these are the kinds of things we need to think about when we want to get engaged with collaborators and when we want to carry out our own research. We need to have good reasons, good ethical reasons why it is we are choosing the kinds of populations we are going to use and how we are going to carry out the research. So we say there's often been misuse of research participants. Why? We often find that there's a lack of safety of proposed research procedures. They sometimes withhold treatment from patients. Why do they only choose certain participants for a study? Often there's inadequate informed consent, and people complain about being randomly allocated to treatment and control groups. So these are some of the ways in which there might be a misuse of research participants. So we need to be very careful who is going to ensure that there are adequate decisions made on the ethical matters of the research you want to carry out for your research study. Again, another aspect which we probably talk about a bit later is publishing results that are statistically incorrect or presenting results in a misleading way. This is also unethical and a misuse of your research findings. So I'm going to stop here for 2 minutes. We can have a little break before I go on to the benchmarks of ethical research. And this is going to be critical as a foundation for the kinds of stuff you need to incorporate into your research protocol and what the research ethics committees will be wanting to see in your protocol to ensure that you have thought through some of the ethical aspects of your study if you wanted to get past. Can we break for a minute or two? Will that be okay, Cynthia?
No, that's fine. That's fine, Prof. We can do that.
We'll just catch our breath and I'll be back in a minute or two.
Okay then, all right. We can take a break, colleagues, and we'll come back. A few minutes. And meanwhile, please put your comments or questions on the chat so that we can discuss them. Or if you are really having a burning question, you can raise your hand, then we can address that. Thank you. Hello. Prof. Naiju, are you back?
We are going to start now talking about in 2004, Isa Kale Emanuel and colleagues developed some ethical principles specifically related to carrying out research in developing countries. And this has evolved since then, but the principles remain the same. And there are essentially a half a dozen principles related to collaborative partnerships, social value, scientific validity, of a study, the fair selection of your sample population, risks and benefits of the participants, importantly, the issue of independent review, informed consent, and respect for participations. I'm going to go through each one individually so you get a good idea, because I know for a fact if we start off with collaborative partnerships, I know many of us are involved with working collaboratively with colleagues, not only within our countries and boundaries, but also with a lot of international collaborative partnerships. And there are numerous things we need to think about when we think about research collaborations with people not familiar with the culture, the living conditions, and the nature of the manner in which countries are run, etc. So one of the things we need to do is to ensure that the kind of partnerships we develop with researchers, policymakers, and the community that we are working with is going to be of a very ethical, fair nature, where we consider the principles that we've just discussed. We need to ensure that we involve partners in sharing responsibilities for determining which are the most important issues that are critical to the community that we want to work in. What is the value of our research going to be? When we do work in a community, we need to respect their values, their cultures, their traditions, their social practices. And to do that, we also need to ensure when we collaborate that researchers, policymakers, and the community all become full and equal partners. We need to ensure that the participants and communities receive benefits from the results of the research we want to carry out in their communities. If we have good collaborative partnerships, this will minimize the possibilities of exploitation. If we demonstrate awareness and respect for cultural differences, this will make a big difference to the communities we are going to want to do research in. And there are 6 key benchmarks related to collaboration. And these are equal partnerships, sharing of responsibilities, mutual respect, and we try and minimize disparities between the participants in the study. We need to ensure that the community receives fair benefits from the conduct and results of the study, and fair distribution of the tangible and the intangible rewards of research needs to be ensured once the study is complete. So the next benchmark we talk about is social value, where we need to specify who is going to benefit from the research you intend to carry out. We need to assess which are the health problems that are being investigated and how beneficial are they going to be for the participants in the study. Enhance the value of the research for each beneficiary through the dissemination of knowledge, product development, long-term research collaboration, and importantly, health systems improvement or infrastructure improvements, whatever the case may be, that's going to add value after the study has been completed. So ethical clinical research particularly must have some social value. Otherwise, we will end up exposing our research participants to unfair, unnecessary risks. So there are 4 benchmarks to ensure social value, and these are: it should be determined who will benefit from research. The potential value of the research should be outlined. We need to ensure that we already have strategies in place so that we can disseminate the findings once the study is complete. And conducting of the research should not undermine existing healthcare services and facilities in that community that you are going to carry out your research in. Scientific validity. This ensures that your research design realizes the social value, especially for the primary beneficiaries of your research. We need to ensure that the research design you have developed realizes the scientific objectives while guaranteeing participants the healthcare interventions to which they are entitled. We need to ensure that the study is feasible within the social, political, and cultural context. Excuse me. And these are the kinds of things that the research ethics committees will be looking at when they look at your protocol. Science and ethics do not conflict. And in fact, valid science is an ethical requirement for us. Valid research includes things in your study design, such as having an adequate sample size, and you've got unbiased ways that you will be measuring outcomes of your study. And unless research generates reliable and valid data that can be interpreted, it will have no social value. And in fact, in some instances, you may even expose participants to risks for no benefit. And this too is something that research ethics committees look at. That is why you need to have a comprehensive methodology in your protocol so they can see you have thought through it, you have looked at the sample size, you've looked at the measurements you are going to make, and they are valid enough to make enough data to secure the outcomes and objectives of your study. So some of the benchmarks then for scientific validity are that the results should be useful in the context of health problems of the community. Interventions should be selected to ensure that the design is useful in identifying appropriate interventions, implementing socially, culturally, and economically appropriate changes in the healthcare system, provide a reliable foundation for subsequent research if need be, and interventions should be selected to ensure that the design will realize social value, and importantly, that the data that you do get out of your research study will be generalizable to the community in which you have carried out the research. The study design must realize the research objectives. I've mentioned that already. And I think ensuring feasibility is also something where in the long term, you might need to think about improvements to healthcare infrastructure, such as skills training, provision of drugs, all following the completion of your study. Then we move on to fair selection. This is another aspect that you need to have well written in your protocol, where you need to describe how are you going to select your study sample to ensure that the findings are going to be valid from your research? How are you going to select a sample to ensure that there are minimal risks and enhance other principles like collaborative partnerships and social value that we just described? And how are you going to ensure that when you identify vulnerable populations in your study, that you are also going to ensure that you will protect them from any harm? So some of the benchmarks for fair selection, we've spoken about the fact that historically populations that were poor, uneducated, and defenseless were targeted for high-risk research. So when we look at selecting populations, we should ensure that we have valid science for why we want to choose that particular population, maybe because they have a high prevalence or incidence of disease, they might have high transmission rates of infection, etc. Minimizing risk is absolutely essential when we do research. And a community of participants should be chosen in which collaborative partnerships can be developed and in which social value can be realized. And factors such as familial coercion, social marginalization, political powerlessness, economic deprivation must be avoided. We need to think about these as a reality in many of the communities we want to carry out research in, and we must be able to determine the vulnerability of the community that we intend to do our research in. Risk-benefit ratios are critical. We need to compare the net risk of your research project with the potential benefits that may be derived, say, from the collaborative partnerships, the social value and respect for the study population. If potential risks outweigh the benefits of the study, the social value must then justify those potential risks. But again, this is something that the research ethics committees always look at. Is there risk to the participant, and how are you going to prevent that? So the risk-benefit ratio must be favorable in the context in which your participants and the study population live in. When participants confront a higher risk of disease, greater potential benefits may justify greater risks in your research design, but you need to motivate for this. And the risk in general, though, the risk-benefit ratio for a community must be favorable. Independent review. This is essentially when the research ethics committees or there's institutional review. This is to ensure that public accountability through reviews are mandated by laws, regulations, proper codes, etc. We have to ensure public accountability through transparency and reviews. Often there are international, there are other non-governmental bodies that are capable of offering and carrying out an independent review of your research protocol. And one needs to use them as appropriate. An independent ethical review of all clinical research protocols is necessary. In multinational research, there's a special need for transparency. It enhances accountability by assuring the public that that research is not exploitative to their community. And the review must be independent and it must be competent. So moving on to informed consent, which we touched on earlier, basically it involves the community in establishing and recruiting procedures and incentives. We need to give them information in culturally and linguistically appropriate formats that the population can understand. We may need to implement supplementary community and familial consent processes in certain population groups where it may be culturally appropriate to do so. We need to obtain consent in cultural appropriate formats, and to ensure that anyone and everyone who participates in your research study has the freedom to refuse to participate or to even withdraw from the study once they have joined at any time without any penalty. So this too needs to be clearly written down in a research protocol, that you, when you obtain informed consent, you are going to ensure that the participant is aware of these issues. And individual informed consent has been recognized as a principle of ethical clinical research for more than a century. Like we discussed earlier, differences in language, social traditions, and practices make the process of informed consent complex. And essentially, we have 5 benchmarks that are used for evaluating informed consent. So when we obtaining consent from a participant, we introduce ourselves, tell them where we're from, what we're about, and then you try and get an indication of what the patient already understands, explain the nature of the condition, outline options and procedures, risks and benefits, times and costs. Then you need to check what has the participant understood. And you can do this by inviting questions from them. You can confirm what they want, and then they can give you consent. So benchmarks for evaluating consent include that you have very good recruitment procedures when you go into a community to enroll a participant into your study. Disclosure of information should be sensitive to the local context. You need to preferably use the local language, culturally appropriate wording that the population can understand. In some instances, in a variety of our communities, there are what we call a variety of spheres of consent, where, for example, you may need to consult with the village elder or the leader of an extended family or a head of a household to get consent from them first before you can then go to seek individual participation for your particular research study. We need to use consent procedures that are acceptable within the community to ensure voluntary participation of their own will. And special attention must be given to ensure that individuals are aware of their right, that they are free to refuse to participate or withdraw from the study. This is critical to research ethics committees to know that you are going to ensure that. So in summary, with the consent issues, we know that people have a right to consent or refuse treatment. Understand the doctrine of necessity for the treatment, or in our case, I mean research. We need the criteria for judging legal competence. We need to appreciate the difference between implied and explicit consent. We need to understand the value of written consent. We need to be aware of cross-cultural issues when we obtain consent. And we need to be particularly careful when we are trying to obtain consent from vulnerable patient populations that may be part of our research study. Finally, we need to respect the participants and the communities that we intend to do our research on. We need to ensure we have procedures in place to protect the confidentiality of all participants that we recruit and enroll on our studies. We need to ensure that the participants can withdraw at any time without penalty, provide participants with information that arises from the study. If we are doing any clinical interventional study, we need to make sure that we monitor those conditions and include research-related injuries that are reported timeously. And importantly, we will show a lot of respect to the communities we have carried out our research in when we go and inform them about the results and the findings of the study. So those are essentially the benchmarks of good research. And while the principles and benchmarks in a way represent a kind of systematic framework, there are many practical considerations that are necessary to justify doing good ethical scientific research. We note that the differences in health, economic, social, cultural aspects of a research setting will influence the manner in which these benchmark and frameworks are applied to the research project. And some of these benchmarks may take up more priority than another, depending on the setting and the type of study that you are intending to carry out. So finally, some checklist and summary related to your project and the kinds of things that a research ethics committee will be looking at when they review your research protocol. They will be looking at the worthiness of your project. How are you going to elicit informed consent? What are the harms, the risks, the benefits? How much honesty and trust and time are you going to give the community with regards to privacy, confidentiality, anonymity of the participants in the study? What about the science, the research integrity, the accuracy, the quality of your findings and your study design? And finally, the ownership of your data, the dissemination of your data, and eventually, how are you going to disseminate and use the findings and the results? Are you going to publish it? Will you go to policymakers to put the findings on the table so that you can initiate some change and benefit to those communities? But these are some of the things that a research ethics committee might be looking for when they review a research protocol. So the recipe, in essence, for good research excellence, good science, good ethical conduct, and our personal and professional integrity at all times while we are carrying out research. So I'm going to stop there for a minute or two again. And the next task that I was asked to do was to talk a little bit about information sheets and consent forms that one always needs as the attachments and as the appendices to your research protocols. So when you're submitting your research protocols, they might want to see your draft questionnaires. They might want to see those very questionnaires translated into a language that's culturally sensitive to the community that you're going to work in. And essentially, the information sheet is critical to the initial exposure that a community will have to your research study. So Cynthia, we want to have a short 2-minute break again. Is that okay? Or should we continue?
It depends on you.
I think we could continue.
Okay, let us continue then. So I'm going to, like I said, an information sheet is something we then design to use to explain the purpose of the research to the participant, to inform them about what they will be required to do or how they are going to be involved in your research study. It should be in super simple language that is appropriate to your target audience and your participants. In some cases, you may need to use an interpreter to ensure that the participants fully understand what it is your research is all about. And all participants should be given a copy of the participant information sheet that they can take home, mull about, read about, consider their options, and then decide whether they should participate in your study or not, and to sign the informed consent form that you will give them. And it is recommended that participants, even if they are completing, for example, an online study and an online questionnaire, that they are given a copy of the participant information sheet prior to that. So the language in the information sheet, we need to use layperson's terminology. The wording should be in such a way that it is not coercive, not forceful to push the participant to participate in the study. Sentences should be short and concise, and any descriptive language we use must also be in lay terms. We must try and avoid using overly technical terms or acronyms or abbreviations that the person might not understand. And if you think they need it, there must be good translation of your information sheet in the language of your participants or research subjects. And I'm saying that it should be translated well, because if you do sometimes get a poor translation, it may be ambiguous and confusing to the participants. So one needs to ensure that you validate and back translate any kind of document that you are translating in very good language of the participants of the research study. So some of the kinds of things we want to see in an information sheet, usually it starts off right at the top of the information sheet. There's usually a clear heading that contains maybe your institutional affiliation or a logo of your institution. It must have the project title, your name, the contact details, all that right at the top of the information sheet. We may need things like the supervisor's name if need be. You might, if you already have an ethics application number, all those kinds of things need to be upfront, right at the top, So the participant is aware that it is a bona fide research project. Then we move on to the introduction. And essentially, participants want to know what will their participation involve in your study. So the purpose of this is really to state the reason the participant is being invited to take part in the research project, and for you to explain the purpose of the form and the nature of the informed consent you want to get from them. So an example text could be things like, you are invited to take part in this research project, and you've been invited because you got to explain the purpose, and your contact details were given to us by this, that. So again, you need the information sheet to tell them what the research project is about. It will explain the processes involved in taking part in the study, and if you decide to take part, what it will involve. So again, right up front, you need to ensure that at some stage you say participation in the research is voluntary, and if you don't want to take part, you do not have to take part. But if you do decide to take part, you will be asked to sign a consent form. So that essentially you need to have, say, in the introductory aspects of your information sheet. Then when we move on to what is the purpose of this research, you need to ensure that in simple terms and in a couple of sentences, you are able to talk about the aim of your project, what's its significance, how does it intend to fill the gaps in the knowledge, how it may contribute to care and to their benefit. You might also want to talk about any relevant background that you know about the community, whether the research, you also need to disclose whether the research is for purposes of obtaining a degree or whether it's for funding, and whether the research has any sponsorship attached to it. Then when we move on to the next question, what does participation in the research involve? We need to include very clear information about who's going to sign the consent form, what are the kinds of initial steps that we are going to be taking. For example, screening for eligibility. Are we going to randomize them and put them in a control group? What are the kinds of procedures and activities that we are going to carry out? The nature of the follow-up, how long it's going to take, etc. There, it is also important to discuss issues about access to personal records, personal history. We can also, if we are going to video anything, audio tape anything, all that needs to be in that section about what does your participation involve. You may be videoed, you may be taped, you may be photographed, etc. And you other information you might need is, you might need some other information to give them in case they ask about follow-up and how long the study. Is there going to be an extension to the study? So those are some of the issues you might need to consider, giving them the possibilities of the risks. And you also have to disclose if there are any disadvantages in taking part. Then they might ask you, do I have to take part in the research project? And you need to explain very clearly that taking part in the research is entirely voluntary. And an example of the text you might want to put in your information sheet will be something like participation in this research project is voluntary. If you do not wish to take part, you do not have to do so. If you decide to take part and later change your mind, you are free to withdraw from the project at any stage. If you do decide to take part, you will be given this participant information sheet. You might be also say you will be given the consent form to sign, and you will have this as a copy to keep. Your decision to take part or not will not affect your routine care. Things like that are important to write on there if they are going to take part in the study. So then people might say, after you've collected the data, what will happen to the information about me? That's what a lot of people are interested in. And there we may need to provide information regarding whether the data we are collecting or used is individually identifiable, or is it non-identifiable? Is it going to be anonymous? Where will the data be kept? Who will have access to it? How long will it be stored for? What will happen to it after the research is finished, etc., etc. So those are some of the things we also need to have written down in that consent form. An issue some of you might be involved in is with data bank and samplings and collecting biopsies, etc. Those also entail another aspect of data banking and data and collection, etc. So we need to, when we talk about risks, just to go quickly back to that, in some instances, those are another critical aspect that the REC committees look at, where you need to disclose that there may be no foreseeable risks to the study. So you do not anticipate anything. The other question is, what if something goes wrong? You need to provide a description of measures that will be taken if a participant suffers any adverse event or anything that results from participation in your research project. When the research project ends, the participant needs to be provided information on how and maybe approximately when they will be provided with a summary of the results after the research has been completed. And sometimes they ask, and this is if you are have funding for the research, it is important that you write down who or what organization may be funding the research. You may need to include the names of any sponsorship that might be part of your research project. In some instances, by the time you submit your information sheet, you might not have information on who has reviewed the project, but if somebody has, you can also put that in the information sheet. And when somebody wants further information and who to contact, here you need to ensure that all information is on there. Your details, your telephone details, your cell phone details, your work details, all those need to be on there to enable the research participant to contact you, to ask you more questions if they are having problems with the study, etc., etc. So those are really essentially the kinds of things you need to have in the information sheet that you are going to provide the patient or the participants before they take part in your study. So from that, you then move on to the consent form. So the information sheet is an integral part of the consent form. And we know that all participants need to provide informed, valid, preferably written consent to be involved in research. So it can be expressed orally or verbally, in writing, etc. But it's going to depend on the nature, complexity, and the level of risk of the research, and also maybe in some instances, the participants' personal and cultural circumstances. Ideally, I would always recommend written, signed, informed consent for any kind of research that we are intending to do. And consent forms are used to gain formal written consent from the participants. And when the signed consent is required, a consent form template should be used. And a copy of the participant information sheet must be given to each participant who is going to sign the consent form, so they know what they have signed and given consent for. And here with just a few, an example of the kinds of things you can put on a consent form before we wrap up for today. And essentially, we need to say at the top of the consent form, this project has been approved by the university or whatever institution research ethics committee. If you have any ethical concerns about the project or questions about your rights as a participant, please contact the executive officer of this committee, the research ethics committee, and provide the telephone and email contact details. So the first section usually of a consent form and what you will put in your research protocol are things like your name as the researcher, your contact details, supervisors' names, project numbers, project title, etc., etc. In the next section, we have the participant certification, where they say, in signing this form, I confirm that I have read the participant information sheet and the nature and purpose of the research has been explained to me. I understand and agree to take part. I understand the nature of my involvement in the project. I understand I may not directly benefit from the project. I can withdraw and this will not affect my status. I confirm I'm over 80. Not all of this may be relevant. You would need to extrapolate as you see fit. I understand this. I understand that photographs, ... if you are using it. And then the participant usually then signs, prints their names and dates it. In some instances, we also require a witness to sign underneath the participant's signature. And then finally, you need to confirm that I have explained the study to the participant and I consider that he or she understands what is involved, and you sign and date, and that will be a completed consent form that you can attach to a person's folder. You could say I've explained the study to the participant to the best of my knowledge. They understand what their involvement is. Something, you know, so this is all for extrapolation, but essentially this is the gist of the kinds of things you may want to see in a consent form that a participant is going to sign, like I said, as it follows on from a very detailed information sheet. And I think that is okay. There's just the other concern the other issue that I was asked to maybe quickly talk about was issues related to your protocol that is being submitted to a research ethics committee. Now, the thing here is that there are a variety of research ethics committees, all looking for different things. They have different requirements. So depending on the rec that you are submitting to, you need to be fully aware of what their requirements are. But in general, I have put down broadly some of the criteria that they may want to look at. And in essence, they might not look at all of it, but these are certainly the kinds of things a research ethics committee will be considering when they receive your protocol in front of them to give approval for ethical clearance. And some of the criteria are, when they look at your introduction and your aims and literature review, is it adequate? Is it adequately referenced? Is there good justification? Why is the study worth doing in this study, etc.? Then they will look at your methodology. And in the methodology, they will look at aspects of the scientific design. And importantly, are you asking the right questions for the problem that you have at hand? And importantly, are your aims and objectives justifiable, and are they going to be completed and achieved within the time frame that you have? So again, the issue we've discussed at length about the selection of participants. Why are you choosing them? Why are you excluding or including them? Have you concerned, how are you going to protect the rights and welfare of vulnerable groups? What about ethnic and language, etc.? Then some of the other things they look at, three, I seem to have missed four now. Are there? Four, they're going to look at how you're going to recruit your sample for your study. What kind of screening are you going to do? What are your research procedures you are going to use? Are they acceptable? Are they in keeping with your aims and objectives? Again, risk benefits. Are the potential risks minimized? Are the potential benefits maximized? They will be looking and examining all these issues when they go through a protocol that has been submitted. So here, then they might look at your data analysis. How are you planning to statistically analyze your data? And importantly, is your sample size and selection adequate enough for carrying out your study and for achieving the aims and objectives? Sometimes there are incentives and compensation associated with the study. You need to describe that in detail. You need to describe how you are going to maintain strict privacy and confidentiality. Nowadays, we might need protocols to describe things like videotaping, digital recordings, etc. And the process of obtaining informed consent or assent, that needs to be adequately described in your research protocol. They want to see all those requirements we described. They will check to see whether the kind of level you are using, language, is of the appropriate level to the population that you are looking at. And the information sheet, has it been translated, etc., etc. And finally, there are some other things research ethics committees may look at. So, for example, they may look at you and your qualifications to carry out or to supervise the research you have put in the protocol. Are the members of your research team adequately qualified to carry out the study? Have you had human subjects protection training, or have you done a GCP course? If there's a budget involved with the research you want to carry out, is it adequate for you to be able to carry out the study that you have proposed? And they do not like it when there are missing documents. So if you are applying to a specific rec, you need to make sure you submit every single document that they need to carry out their ethical review of your project. And again, we discussed about the issues of how will communities and participants be informed of findings, and how will the findings be disseminated more broadly, publishing, presenting, etc., etc. So at the end of the study, they also want you to write down how you are going to manage the data, the dissemination, etc., and all that needs to be described in the protocol for a research ethics committee. So I think I'm going to stop here now. I'm not sure if we have any pressing questions. If not, I would prefer it if participants can email me directly with any specific questions or queries they have relating to this presentation today, so that I can respond to them directly via email. Will that be in order, Cynthia?
Yes, I think it will. I think it will. Can you hear
listening.
me?
Yes, I can.
Although everybody should have benefited from your responses.
I think we have some few questions in the chat. We have 3 questions in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah. The first one want to know some limitation of confidentiality.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Some limitations of confidentiality.
Yeah, essentially there aren't many. Where the issue of confidentiality came to the fore when we started doing research was with the advent of the HIV pandemic. And many people felt that they had to disclose the HIV status to their fellow researchers, or to a clinician, or to a fellow carer of a person with HIV. But you know, that really came to the fore, and we need to be very, very careful if we are ever planning to disclose or pass on any kind of confidential information, that we ask the participant or the patient first whether we can disclose this to a third party. And if the person gives us permission, you can disclose it. But if they don't, that will be a very serious breach of confidentiality.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, what are some of the considerations of competence boundaries?
Yeah, I think that there, again, different countries have different guidelines with regards they will fall into a vulnerable population group, and the determination of competence I hope I'm understanding the question correctly, because it's very broad, and I'm not sure whether they mean competence of the participant taking part in the study or competence of the researcher. But I guess it's competence of the participant. And like I said, they may fall into this. Often happens when you are investigating or doing a study in a vulnerable research population. And there are very, very clear guidelines, though they may differ in different countries, about how one elicits competence for signing. I didn't go into the issue of children and people under the age of 18. Again, the ages vary in different countries, where you can get consent at different stages from different age groups. But with children, you may need parental consent, you may need carer consent, and it varies in different situations and in different countries. So one needs to be very, very clear and cognizant about what the guidelines and rules say in your country where you are carrying out the research. So even if you are going into another country to do research, you need to be very familiar with the kinds of codes and guidelines that they use regarding age of consent, age of assent, determination of competence, vulnerability, etc., etc. But there's nothing fixed that I can tell you in 2 lines that go with it. So one needs to just be aware that it's different in different places, and you need to be very aware of the country or location or site that you are working in. What are the guidelines that are available at that time in that location that you need to consider for your study?
And the third question is, for how long should a researcher keep the signed consent form?
Yeah, again, this is usually determined, again, with the guidelines of a country and within their national ethical guidelines, but certainly for the duration, for the entire duration of a study, those forms need to be kept. And I would say for a minimum of 5 to 8 years thereafter, that form should be kept, and it varies. And in some instances, a research ethics committee will actually state how long you need to keep data, how long you need to keep consent forms, and at which stage you need to destroy data, say like audiovisual recordings or tape recordings. You need to be very clear that you are going to keep it for 2 years after the study, and then it's going to be destroyed. But again, these guidelines are different in different countries. So usually the Medical Research Council, I know there's a Medical Research Council in different parts of Africa. They have guidelines as well that one can follow that are general and more broad-based to tap into to get those kinds of country, national details.
Thank you very much, Professor Naidu. I'm sure, you know, it was very, very exciting to everybody. And I think it's a wake-up call for all of us. We now have to reflect how much of what you have shared with us have we been applying and where can we improve. It was a very, very exciting presentation. Thank you very much. I will ask our Vice President of the AfroPHC if she's there to say a few remarks before we wind up.
Okay, good afternoon.
Yes, hello.
This is Dr. Iska Moth from Kenya. I appreciate the presentation that has been done by the professor, and it has a lot of insights in the oncoming research team or group that would wish to do the research. The area of consent and the other research protocols has come out very, very clearly. And this will guide us if we are intending to conduct studies. And most of the guidelines are based on countries. For example, maybe the age limit or the age cutoff for Kenya is 18 years, because that is when one is considered an adult and probably is able to give consent. So it is very, very important whenever you are doing a study, there is need to go by the guidelines of that country.
Yes.
Otherwise, thank you.
Thank you so much. If there's anyone who has a comment before we hand over to the Vice President of AfroPHC. If not, Madam Vice President, can I invite you to address the audience? Thank you.
My background is not good. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you are watching. I sincerely want to thank Prof for this teaching. I think most of us, if we had listened to this training before writing some research protocols, a lot of things would be ameliorated. It was really, in fact, and the way it was being elaborated, you can just use it and work on a research and carry out a research with your supervisor. So I want to sincerely thank Prof for the way she has given this training and this teaching. And I know that a lot of us here have learned a lot, and her contact has been shared on the platform for those that want to reach her. Thank you, Sankire, for the hard work you are doing concerning research in AfroPHC. Thank you, Cynthia, for this wonderful moderation. It's the first time I'm seeing you again after South Africa. I'm glad to see you. So we are looking forward to many, many, many great research work in 2013. And even our research mentoring in AfroPHC, I think if we had received this teaching, a lot of people should have come up with something. So Prof, your teaching has gone a long way to enlighten a lot of us. And those of us that have written some work, I think I just have to go back and look again some steps that I took and see where I really made a mistake and see how to correct it. So you see how it's going to be touching and really going to educate a lot of us. Thank you very much. I'm glad that Grace is here. I've been trying to do some work with Grace Goran. I'm happy that you are listening to this teaching alongside with me. So I think we can do something better. Thank you, Ray. I'm glad you are doing this good job, and you've really been engrossed in research. I know you have also learned. So thank you all for attending. Please always join us in AfroPHC. It's such an interesting place to learn for those that are beginning, and also want to encourage those that are mentoring others to keep doing the work. You'll be glad to see what they will become tomorrow. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you. See you next year.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for
Happy
listening.
holidays.
Happy holidays, exactly.
Happy holidays, Prof. Thank you.
We meet next year because the research meetings continue. So let's
Yes.
have more people coming to these meetings, and we are sharing ideas, and we move on with research, because research really guides practice. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
I almost missed it. I was talking after I said, these people have called me to close this meeting.
Okay, meeting is over.